Thank you, Galen, for giving me this challenge last time, of giving a talk on the limitations on human rationality. I've been a great believer in human intelligence, and maybe not in my own so much as in the principle of the thing. And I actually used to think that there's no problem so big or so complicated that a great mind can't reason its way out of it. At least if it's given enough information and time. And then I came around to a book called What Intelligence Tests Miss, The Psychology of Rational Thought, and it's written by a guy called Keith Stanovich. And he's not a terribly good writer. He repeats himself a lot. But this message, I think it needs to be repeated, and I forgive him. And one thing he said in this book that really made an impression on me, and I think he's right. He says that if you gave every human being a pill that added 20 points to their IQ score, now, we would still be making the same mistakes tomorrow. Only we would probably be making them a little faster and more effectively. However, the most important insight we can get from this book is a very short one. It's 5 words. We are all cognitive misers, he says. It's shorthand for the fact that the brain will always try to use the simplest and sketchiest model of the world that it can get away with. And there are many reasons why we're cognitive misers, and one is that when brains and sensory systems first started to evolve, they were kind of primitive. But these early brains still helped keep their owners alive, and over the next several 100 million years they kept evolving. And they've always kept this as their first priority. The evolutionary purpose of the brain is to keep its owner alive and promote his or her reproductive success, and not primarily to take him or her to the moon. And when you look at the brain from that angle, it's an absolutely amazing device. Normal computer programs, they need to be complete. They need to be double and triple checked for bugs, and if something's wrong, they crash. And the brain, on the other hand, it starts out with practically no program at all. It has some prepared circuits. But otherwise, it can make do with only the vaguest beginning of an idea. If something is missing, it simply fills in the blanks with whatever looks most probable and goes on computing. If it needs a concept, it forms one on the spot. And if input from one sense is missing or confusing, it just consults the other senses. And the stuff we use to fill in the blanks usually fits so well that we're not aware that anything is missing. But this is as it should be. A bigger and more complicated model will require more processing power from the brain. The smaller and simpler we can make the model, the easier we will get by and the more we will get done. And this type of optimization seems to be a general principle behind the way the whole nervous system is organized. Brains are optimized for speed, not accuracy. And part of this is that every task that the brain can delegate to a lower level of consciousness will be delegated and to the lowest possible level. If there's enough information that a lower level of a nervous system knows what to do with it without bothering a conscious mind, then that action will usually be taken without any further notification to higher quarters. The most extreme example of this is the simple reflex that we learned about in school, you know, the jerking knee, or coffee being a little too hot. And this process of delegation happens all over our sensory systems, and I'd like to take the eye as an example here. Imagine that we're staring at a field of uniformly grey sky. All the little rods and cones at the back of your eye will be reporting the same message. Now imagine that a pinpoint of light suddenly comes on in the sky, and just one of these little cells is illuminated. One of these lasers, you know. Can you hear it? It's jumping up and down saying, "I see light!" And his neighbors, they don't see a thing. The neighbors are going to report a false drop in light intensity, as if they'd suddenly gotten darker. It's as if they become jealous. Now that my neighbors got more, I'm going to tell the brain that I'm less. By the time the signal leaves the eye, it has already been heavily doctored. Contrasts and movement have been emphasized, and that makes it just simple enough for the brain to take effective action. And the eye is only one example. all sensory input has to travel through a whole hierarchy of nerve cells on its way towards the top level of full consciousness. And long before it gets there, salient points have been emphasized. Others have been suppressed. Different forms of input are compared and used to emphasize or cancel each other out. And for every level that a signal passes on the way to full consciousness, details will get lost. Here is an explanation of the so-called cognitive biases. Every one of these biases seem to be an expression of how our brains are optimized for speed and computational ease rather than accuracy. And I'll mention a few examples here. One of the best known is called the confirmation bias. It's one of the most pervasive because it's an expression of how we don't interpret sensory input from scratch. Whatever happens will be filtered through layers and layers of memories and also about predictions for the future. It starts conforming to your ideas of what the world should look like. Confirmation bias is very close to my own heart. The way lawyers, because I'm a lawyer, and their clients always seem to be more sensitive to information going in their favor than to information pointing the other way. The result is a fundamental inefficiency in how legal disputes are settled. My personal estimate is that at least 75% of lawyers' incomes are derived from this factor alone. But then again, I'm biased. Next bias I'd like to talk about is called base rate neglect or base rate fallacy. It's the tendency to base judgments on specifics and to ignore general statistics information because that's more abstract and hard to relate to. Two more. The bandwagon effect is another kind of very common cognitive bias. It occurs when we don't bother to form all our ideas from scratch. Somebody else has done much of the processing for us and we just take it at face value. It's a huge problem in some circumstances. Look at what happened in Germany from 1933 to 1945. And sometimes, and it's a huge source of efficiency in other contexts. It makes society run that much faster than if everybody had to think for themselves. And the last, the availability cascade, is a self-reinforcing process in which a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through increased repetition in public discourse. Repeat something long enough and it will become true. What's available in memory gets the appearance of being more likely. And as we know, our memories are biased towards vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged examples. Now back to Keith Stanovich and the book about what intelligence tests miss. He sees all these biases, and I must say they are our default mode of operation, as a failure to operate rationally. And it's easy to agree with him. These cognitive biases are examples of how the human brain needs to function, if it is to function at all. It's all very well to know exactly what sand is. I mean, look, who knows what sand is? There's so much we need to learn about sand. But sometimes we just have to throw it in the eyes of the attacking tiger and get on with our lives. The reason is that our highest level of rational consciousness, that Stanovich calls type 2 reasoning, consumes a lot of resources. If we were to try to attain the highest possible level of rationality in all aspects of life, we'll get to be right, but we won't get to do much else. There's also the problem of focus when we're trying to engage in what he calls type 2 fully conscious and rational reasoning. Our highest level of attention is very much like a ship's radar or like a flashlight. It can only look in one direction at a time. And with the first naval radar sets, the captain of the ship actually had to steer his ship in a full circle if he wanted to scan the whole horizon. So he had to steer around. And later radars, of course, were built with revolving antenna. But it's still looking in one direction at a time. It just goes around the whole horizon. And my thesis here is that if our human system of attention regulation had been set in this manner, making us pay equal attention to everything, I doubt that we'd ever gotten out of the primordial ooze. The cognitive biases occur because we have no choice. We'll be lucky if we can compensate for one or two of them at a time. I'll shine my flashlight over there and I'll understand one thing. But while my attention is there, I have to operate on autopilot all round the circle. I said before that every task that the brain can delegate to a lower level of consciousness will be delegated and to the lowest possible level. My second insight that this seems to explain why training is so much more powerful than learning. Learning is about understanding and memorizing facts and rules. It's an incredibly powerful tool. It's powerful because it's about deepening your understanding of why we should and shouldn't do things, like point a sextant at the sun or eat less sugar. Without learning in this sense, we'd be stuck in the Stone Age. And yet, training, I say, is more powerful because it's all about creating subconscious dispositions to do one thing rather than another. It's about what stimulates our reward centers in our brains and what creates our aversions. It's known as behavior training, shaping, and a host of other names. Well-known examples are Ivan Pavlov and his drooling dogs, or B.F. Skinner and his superstitious pigeons. You heard about them? I'll tell you about them later. It's great fun. He even built a pigeon-controlled cruise missile. If training and learning contradict each other, the thing you're trained to do, or trained to think, will usually dominate. The reason, I believe, is that the training operates at the lower level of consciousness. And therefore it tends to determine our actions long before we've had time to think them over. It makes us want to do things, not just because there might be a bucket of fish or praise or ice cream at the end of it, but because the action has come to feel natural for us. Our reward centers have been stimulated enough times when we did that, it just feels good. It feels like who we are rather than what we do. My third insight, and here's why we're approaching the universalists, is a feeling that I can now explain God rationally, and that God doesn't need to exist. As I said before, the brain will always try to use the simplest and sketchiest model it can of the world they can get away with. And can you imagine a simpler model than God for how the earth and the universe came to be? I can't. Can you imagine a simpler source of ultimate authority than God behind the rules we try to make each other follow? I can't that either. And when I look at God from that angle, it doesn't seem to matter anymore whether he exists or not. All that matters is whether the concept makes it easier for us to operate at the level of accuracy that's needed at the moment. And rational analysis is slow and cumbersome. I've established that. It's very narrow in focus. And it's at constant risk for irrational cognitive bias. So it's actually a pretty weak tool. When we're stressed, when the stress hormones build up, actually our prefrontal cortex closes down, or it's suppressed. I didn't know that. You're going on autopilot because you have no choice. Your hormones are just shut down to the prefrontal cortex, or enough of it that you can no longer trust yourself to be anything but an autopilot. And if you want to get yourself out of that mode, the only thing you can do is train yourself. You have to program the autopilot, because stuffing more knowledge into your brain is not going to do the trick. It's quite a sobering thought, because I've gone all of my life and I've been thinking, why wasn't I smarter back then? And I wasn't smarter because I was an autopilot. So if the police and our human rationality were to be our only bulwarks against moral transgressions, I think we'd be worse off than we are today. It may be irrational to believe in the wrath of God and eternal damnation, but in times of great temptation, rationality is usually playing the second fiddle anyway. So this is not to say that I want to start scaring little children out of their wits again about how God will be sad or angry or how they'll burn in hell if they don't do as I say. I'm saying that whatever we bring up to fill the void when God goes out the window needs to be simple and powerful and capable of acting directly on an irrational mind. But I hope that we can let this society here, this fellowship grow, and help each other program our subconscious minds to do the right things, to sacrifice when sacrifice is needed, and to follow the rules that no longer seem binding just because God said so. Because I'm sorry, but I have a problem with God in that role. And when God goes out the window, sometimes we're the poorer for it. And that's how I'd like to start the discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.